I'm grateful to the seminary for granting me a sabbatical and to all of you for coming to this lecture. I spent some of my sabbatical sojourn laboring on a history of early Christian music, but I also worked on another project designed for use in my teaching. A small novella that recounts a day in the life of a fictional, ancient Mediterranean family who lived in the city of Rome in the 60s of the Common Era. What seminary students learn about antiquity is often abstract, with the result that the wider world in which the early church carried out its mission remains a kind of indistinct background composed of talking heads and disembodied practices described in introductions and books on early Christian backgrounds. I wanted to make something of the ancient environment more vivid, concrete, and memorable for students. Hence my choice of a narrative form with a focus on a day in the life of a single Mediterranean family at a moment of crisis. The novella also aims to be a bridge for denizens of the 21st century to the people of the first century. For us, the ancient Mediterranean world is a foreign land. But in our rush to bring the New Testament into our own time and place, we often fail to see that. Even when we bracket our impulse to fit a biblical text immediately into our own theology, we tend to interpret the world from which it came only in Christian terms. Pagans exist for us only gauzily and grayly until they enter the church. Hence my story has no Christians in it. The household consists of Mentor, his wife Semele, his son Ariston, Ariston's wife Cresame, their boy Titos, and a newborn infant, as yet unnamed. They are immigrants from Greece living in Rome, and Mentor is a grammarian who once conducted a school, but has lost his students with disastrous results for his family. Mentor now works as an occasional day laborer, filling concrete forms at the construction site of the Arcus Neroniani, a new arm of Rome's aqueduct system. His son Ariston labors in a commercial bakery. Neither is able to work every day, and together they earn about 8.5 sesterces a week. That's not much, and some of it goes for rent. The remainder is insufficient for a healthy diet. The family has been reduced to bread and water and is now living below bare subsistence needs. Because of these dire circumstances, Mentor has explained to his daughter-in-law, Cresame, that unless there is an immediate change in the family's income, she must dispose of her newborn child. And he has forbidden her from naming it. A change in the family's fortunes may be in the offing, however. Mentor is to attend a dinner party at the house of a wealthy man named Cordus, who, Mentor understands, is interested in adding a grammarian to his circle of clients. Apparently, Cordus wants someone around to improve his Greek and to tutor his son, Ammonius. A friend has spoken to Cordus about Mentor, and Cordus has extended the dinner party invitation in order to meet Mentor and size him up. The family's fate, and especially the fate of the newborn, now hang on this dinner party. In this lecture, I will not be narrating the story of Mentor and his family. Instead, I will discuss elements of the cultural framework that informs the story. But if you'd like to read the story, send me an email and I'd be happy to send it to you. The feelings, aspirations, and even daily activities of the female characters were much more difficult for me to imagine than those of the male characters. Semele and Cresame are poor women living with their family in a little garret room at the top of a multi-storied apartment building. Our ancient sources give us no direct testimony from such women and say little about them. What did they do? What went on in their minds and between them? One might imagine that by sharing care of children, poor urban women could work outside their homes to better the conditions of their families. Scholars who have addressed the question of women's labor in ancient Rome admit that there is little evidence of women of the lower classes engaging in work for pay apart from a few respectable jobs and some unrespectable avenues of employment in which desperate women made themselves sexually available to men as waitresses in cook and drink shops and as prostitutes in brothels. We know that some women were wet nurses and midwives. Others worked in laundries and in wool making. Laundry work, however, was done mostly by men, which means that women were in competition with men for that kind of work. Moreover, both free men and free women had to compete with slave labor. A slave was less expensive to an employer over time than a hired laborer, even cheaper than an animal for work such as pushing a mill wheel. Hence, it is likely that most free-born day laborers were underemployed. Free women who lacked a special skill or trade were at an even greater disadvantage. The challenges women faced in the labor market are also evident from the way the ancient sources talk about widows. Their powerlessness and dependence on others for support was proverbial and was widely recognized by ancient writers. Papyrological evidence from Egypt suggests that most women were older women and that few remarried, probably because most men preferred younger wives. We do not hear of widows working or being encouraged to seek work. Apparently, there was no real labor market for them. The same must have applied to many other women who might otherwise have wished to work, married or unmarried. Now, one influential modern historian writes that Roman women were so lazy that they did not even do the shopping. They simply strolled about Rome looking for amusements. He is speaking of upper-class women, perhaps unfairly of them, not of lower class, the women of the lower classes, many of whom were largely confined to the one-room apartments in which they lived, who cared for their children but had little else to occupy themselves except to keep each other's company. Given their poverty, there was practically no shopping for them to do. There was much care of children, but almost no other domestic work in a one-room flat. Since time immemorial, the ideal wife had been depicted in Proverbs, described by male writers, as sitting at home spinning, weaving, and sewing. The making of clothes was deemed her special art and proper task. But poor women in first century Rome did not spend their time spinning and weaving. Almost all cloth in Roman cities was ready-made. Yes, it was turned into articles of clothing at home, but poor people had little clothing, and they made what they had last a long time. Poor women mended, of course, but what little clothing there was needed little mending. Likewise, they had little cooking to do. Bread was the main staple of the poor, and it was purchased from street vendors, not baked at home. Other elements of the primary daily meal were simple: water and perhaps a porridge cooked on a brazier or eaten cold. Poor women attended the public games and festivals, but otherwise were barred from wider cultural experiences. And the domestic life to which they were confined did not include the satisfying elements of running a household that are celebrated in depictions such as that of Proverbs 31, if I can borrow a biblical example. Spinning and weaving, ordering foods from far-off markets, considering a field and buying it, overseeing the planting of a vineyard, and engaging in works of charity. Not all women were poor. Some had opportunities for education. They pursued literature, wrote poetry, and engaged in the other arts. Thanks to an inheritance or a special skill, a significant number of women were able to go into business. Hence, we find women involved in all sorts of commercial activity in the Roman Empire, from keeping shops to larger-scale enterprises. Recent historical writing about women in the Greco-Roman world has made considerable gains in bringing this side of ancient women's history to light. And the emerging picture is worth celebrating for many reasons. At the same time, it is important to keep in mind and remember the other women, the majority probably, who through no fault of their own never had opportunities to learn to read or go into business, who could not find respectable employment, and whose avenues for activity were very limited. Many were slaves, underfed, overworked, and used by their masters for sexual gratification. Of the free women, most were married and spent their childbearing years rearing children, an alarming number of which did not survive infancy. As many as 30% perhaps. Mothers died in childbirth too. Those who survived their childbearing years and outlived their husbands had great difficulty finding any means of supporting themselves. Often their relations were too poor to provide for them. Widowhood in antiquity was almost synonymous with beggary. Women of all classes shared some of the same griefs, of course. Infant mortality was high, as I have said, and there was something else. It has been estimated that only 9 out of 10 children in the Greco-Roman world were reared by their parents. The other 10% were put to death or exposed. If 2 women had 10 children between them over the course of their lifetimes, they likely lost 3 of those children in infancy, and 1 of those losses was likely due to infanticide or exposure. In other words, half the women of the Roman world suffered the loss of a child in this way, which means that almost every woman had a sister, a daughter, a close friend who was compelled to expose or put to death a newborn. The chief reason for infanticide was family poverty. When a poor family reached a certain size, raising an additional child put other family members at risk. In the words of one ancient author, sometimes when parents had begotten 1, 2, 3 children, they feared to give birth to any more, lest they reduce the others to beggary. In certain instances, however, fathers made the decision about whether to rear a child not on the basis of survival, but in order to maintain a certain level of prosperity, or to increase the chances of upward social mobility. It is difficult to know whether poverty or some other reason motivated the educated man who wrote the following letter to his expected wife at the dawn of the Common Era. "If I receive my pay soon, I will send it up to you. If you have the baby before I return, if it is a boy, let it live. If it is a girl, expose it." Such an exposed child might be picked up by slave dealers or by a household looking to increase its size, in which case the foundling could be adopted or treated as a slave in the household. Most, however, simply perish. Philo tells us that the majority of people in his day did not attribute humanity to a newborn. They believed that there was some brief period when the baby was not capable of human feeling. This attitude probably partly explains the rarity of funerary dedications for infants and the legal regulations that prohibited mourning for them. Men saw it as their duty to make the hard decision about whether or not to raise a child. They also sought ways to transfer that decision into the hands of the gods. The astrological charts of Julius Firmicus Maternus include the following categories of fates for newborn children. Will be nourished for a few days before being thrown into water. Will either be exposed or not nurtured. Will be suffocated at birth or devoured by dogs. Clearly, these are not simply predictions of events lying outside human control. They express putative intentions of fate. By consulting an astrologer, a man sought a divine sanction for his actions. But let's consider the matter from the mother's perspective. She was in an excruciatingly helpless position, since it was not her place to decide whether to keep her child or not. Yet she was often commanded to do the killing or the exposing. And having done so, she was not permitted to mourn, at least not publicly. According to Pomponius, a Roman jurist, mourning rites were prohibited for children under a year old. And how could a mother have mourned an infant she exposed or suffocated? What mourning ritual, legal or illegal, existed for that? What ritual container? Did a woman even talk about such a thing with her friends? Ancient Jews opposed infanticide. The church fathers attacked it, and in the post-Constantinian era, the practices of exposure and infanticide were banned. It is easy for the modern person to see in this an upward step in a bumpy but ascending movement of history toward a better world, as inhumane practices are abandoned one by one. To what extent history does in fact bend toward justice is not a question I will engage here, except to observe that the belief that the world can be fundamentally altered in its basic social structures, reinvented, so to speak, by dint of a social movement in the twinkling of a generation, or more patiently, generation by generation, continues to be deeply embedded in the modern consciousness. The modern person believes that history can produce something new, not merely a return to a prior remembered state of equilibrium that has been thrown out of balance, but revolution in the sense of fundamental social transformation. The people of Mentor's culture have no notion of such a possibility. They know that the world changes, of course, but in their understanding, it changes in recurring ways. It would not be accurate to say that they cannot imagine a different social order. Mentor knows that both Stoics and Epicureans teach that slavery and gender inequality are unnatural. Some Stoics support education for women, and there is a Stoic tradition of an ideal city in which there is no longer slavery and gender differences are all but obliterated. Yet the ideal city is not a practical political concept. It is a way of interpreting the philosopher's detached, alien, and countercultural relationship to the existing world. Hence, we are not surprised that the 2nd century Roman emperor Marcus Aurelius, author of a well-known book of Stoic philosophy, made no effort to alter the basic social structures of society in egalitarian directions according to his Stoic ideals. The reason was not simply that he had a class interest in slavery, he did, nor that there were limits to what even emperors could do, there were. The reasons were also philosophical. Marcus assumed the providential ordering of the world by the Logos, which assigns each person a place in the social order. Hence, social reality was not for Marcus a set of material conditions to be transformed on the basis of philosophy. The purpose of philosophy was to help individuals gain self-mastery through inner moral transformation so that they could adjust to their place in life and enjoy a sense of well-being that was not affected by their external circumstances. To return to Mentor, he, like many educated people in his day, regards the distant past, not the future, especially not any historical future, as the locus of a better world. For him, it is Homer's Iliad that preserves the memory of such a place. This revered story, told in epic verse, is the primary text of the Greco-Roman schoolroom. Its incidents among surviving papyri suggests that it was the most copied work in antiquity. Those who lived in the 1st century viewed mime performances of the Iliad in city theaters, and elites were treated to dramatic recitations at dinner parties. In many ways, the Iliad was a kind of scripture for Greeks, as well as for those Romans who regarded themselves as heirs of the Greek cultural heritage. Mentor has committed most of the Iliad to heart. When he arrives for work at the Arcus Neroniani, with the first hints of sun on the rooftops, he thinks of Homer's rosy-fingered dawn, when dark ships set forth on bright seas. He pictures the ships and repeats to himself the words, "Now let us launch a ship into the bright sea, and supply it with due number of rowers, and place on board a hecatomb, and embark on it the fair-cheeked daughter of Crucis." If there is a brave, beautiful world, a world to which a man truly belongs, it exists in Homer, Mentor believes, only there. And there in that world, he himself dwells spiritually, in a realm of collective memory without future promise. The fair-cheeked daughter of Crucis is never named in the Iliad. Although the action that sets the story in motion hinges on her fate, she is referred to only as her father's daughter. This omission of her name is symptomatic. The Iliad describes a man's world, a heroic age in which men compete in battle for honor. A man kills glorious and is honored for it. Even if he is killed, he can die honorably. The Iliad memorializes these individual agonistic moments of personal victory and nobility in defeat. According to Jane Levin, more than 200 Achaean and Trojan warriors are described in the Iliad, and almost every one is named, briefly portrayed in a moment of battle, and characterized by a few honorific words about his excellences. The agonistic spirit of competition pervades Mentor's world as well, not only because that spirit is part of the Roman love of combat, celebrated in propaganda about Roman military conquest, and enacted in gladiatorial games and other public spectacles and competitions. The social sphere itself is agonistic. Almost every interaction of one man with another is an exchange of honor, in which he can preserve his dignity or suffer shame. For the dinner party at the house of Cordus, Mentor needs a dinner coat. He asks his friend Neleus to lend him one. This is an honor-fraught interchange. The loan is a gift, it creates a debt, and symbolizes Neleus' superiority in their relationship. The dinner party itself will be a social competition, full of little battles over honor. If Mentor fares well, he will not only be able to feed his family, he will have his dignity back. Dinner parties, or banquets as they are often called in modern scholarship, are emblematic of the ways in which social life in the Greco-Roman world was structured, for men in particular, in terms of honor and shame. Closely connected with this is another basic aspect of society. The person of wealth gained honor through benefaction. The banquet of a wealthy man was regarded as an act of benefaction when it included those who could not reciprocate in kind. His clients, for example. The client in the ancient sense was not someone who paid for a service, but someone who rendered services in exchange for gifts by a patron in the context of a hierarchical personal relationship. Each morning, the client greeted the patron at home. The client often formed part of a daily entourage and concluded the day with a banquet put on by his patron. The writer Lucian satirizes patron-client relationships in a little work called On Salaried Posts in Great Houses, in which he mocks those who stoop to the humiliation of becoming clients. Later, finding himself in dire straits, Lucian himself became a client in a big house and was compelled to write a retraction of his early writing on the subject. In my little novella, I describe the dynamics of patronage from a client's point of view by portraying a conversation between Mentor and Neleus, who is full of reasons why Mentor should not leap hastily into life, the life of a client in the house of Cordus. You will be no better than a slave, Neleus tells him, and the salary will not compensate. Cordus knows the value of money. He won't want to give you much. Here is how it will be. Cordus will invite you to dinner. His wealthy associates will be there and a few other clients. The clients will see you as a rival and will do their best to make you feel unwelcome. But Cordus will be charming, and you will dine sumptuously. The next day, he will call for you. You will hurry to his house with great anticipation, expecting a private meeting in the tablinum. Instead, you will find Cordus and a few of his friends in the atrium. He will introduce you to the others as his friend. He may even speak eloquently about your new relation to him and his society. Friends have all things in common, he will say. What is mine is yours, and what is yours is mine. Of course, you'll be so delighted by these warm words and the smiling, well-dressed friends that you may not notice the insinuation that perhaps he ought to have your services free of charge, since you are, after all, his friend. And if you bring up the question of the salary, Cordus will make that subject seem slight, even a bit distasteful, as a subject for friends. I am confident, he will say, that you have not joined our little household because you are looking for pay like a bricklayer, but rather for other reasons, the chance to be our intimate, and the honor you shall share as a member of our circle, sharing our table. But let there be some remuneration, a modest stipend. Then he will name a small amount, and in that same breath, he will promise unspecified gifts on feast days and will remark that his dinners alone are the equivalent of a generous salary. The subject of friendship in Nellius's description of the patron-client relationship presents another complicated feature of life in the Greco-Roman world. An uneasy relationship exists between the agonistic norms of the society and the value of friendship. The tension is evident in conflicts between ancient banquet ideals and reigning banquet protocols. The banquet was a pervasive social institution in the ancient Mediterranean world. People held private banquets at home. They held banquets in temples, which were outfitted with dining rooms. All the various clubs, burial societies, guilds, philosophical associations, and other groups held banquets. Scholarly work on this subject has been filling out the picture of banquets in antiquity and identifying certain recurring traits or patterns. Here I will mention 4 salient points. First, it was not only the upper class who put on banquets with entertainments. The lower classes did so as well. From late Ptolemaic Egypt, we have some fragmentary remains of minutes of one of the lowlier clubs. This society, of perhaps 10 members, gathered regularly for festive meals, but was too poor, it seems, to hire a hall for its meetings, and convened sometimes in the harness room of a stable, sometimes in a storeroom. Nevertheless, it had a presiding officer, and one of its members served as a priest, presumably to conduct the sacrifice in connection with the customary libations at the meal. The club levied dues that paid for modest amounts of bread and wine, and it also had entertainments. A piper and a dancer are mentioned for one meeting. As this club shows, the poor imitated the upper classes. They could not carry this off on the scale of the wealthy, but they did what they could in order to dine with dignity. Second, a literary tradition about banqueting informs and offers critiques of actual banqueting. The Greeks had a long-standing genre of writing about banquets. This literary form persisted from the time of Plato, if not before, well into the Roman era. In this literature, imaginary banquets are portrayed, and in the more philosophical forms of this literature, banquet values and practices are discussed, which gives us a picture of banquet ideals that perdure over centuries, especially in the discourse of the educated. Central to these ideals are the values of friendship, philia, and equality, isautes. When hosts and guests gather to share a meal, all are equal. So says banquet ideology. But in practice, distinctions are made. It is customary in high society not only to observe a strict pecking order in seating, but also to vary the food and drink, depending on social status. Pliny the Younger claims that at a banquet he attended, the host divided the wine glasses into 3 categories, according to size, providing large glasses for himself and his best friends, a smaller size for his lesser friends, and the smallest size for the freedmen. Third, because wealthy hosts served as benefactors to their clients by giving banquets at which their clients were guests, the banquet enacted the servile status of the client. Although the client was free, he compared himself to a slave. We find this over and over in Greco-Roman literature. Free persons describing any humiliating treatment of themselves as a form of slavery. Orlando Patterson's interpretation is especially illuminating here. In the ancient world, he observes, as well as in modern slave societies, antebellum America, for example, the way freedom is conceived is conditioned by the social fact of slavery. An implication is that not only are the elites of society economically dependent on slavery, they are also socially and psychologically dependent on it, invested in it. Moreover, this ideology pervades the culture as a whole. All free persons, even the lowliest, have a social stake in slavery as one important source of their personal dignity, the honor they have in not being slaves. Fourth, and related to the preceding points, the banquet is the scene of interactions that often have a competitive edge, since honor is at stake in the convivial exchanges. Lucian depicts a would-be client at a banquet who hopes to impress his wealthy host, but feels ill-equipped to compete with others. Looking back on the experience, the aspiring client complains, "Numerous and numberless things, almost everything irritates you, especially when some lewd fellow or dancing teacher or Alexandrian pipsqueak stringing verses of poetry together outshines you." The purpose of a client at a banquet was to be an ornament, and for that he needed a talent that could be shown off at a dinner party. Competition and rivalry pervaded other aspects of social life. It is both surprising and instructive to learn how many defictiones, binding spells, have come down to us from antiquity in lead tablets and on papyri. These artifacts, along with references to curses in literature, attest a widespread belief in their power, and their abundance implies that people took them for granted as part of everyday life. Binding spells were used for many things, but one of their common applications was to deal with enemies. Here is an example of language from such a curse tablet, in which words addressed to the spirit of the underworld are as follows. "Hand Plotius over to Phoebus, so that they wrestle and struggle with him. Let them overcome him to the point where they snatch away his life. And I hand him over to you so that you may deal with him by the month of February. Let him perish miserably." A fever, an illness, a setback in one's business or profession, a failure in love, any misfortune might make one suspicious that a spell was responsible. That suspicion naturally made the suspected source some rival, not simply a competitor, but an enemy who was ready to act in malign ways. In response, one took countermeasures with spells of one's own. Even love spells were threatened. Men desired women erotically. They were not looking for soulmates, and in many cases scarcely knew the young woman for whom they pined. The spells they used to secure a woman's desire often entailed the symptoms of fever, and it was believed that these love spells sometimes killed. 1 in 7 die from them, one source says. In other words, a man sought to bind a woman erotically, a teenage girl in most cases, and he did so in the belief that the spell might prove deadly. This also means that a girl suffering from fever, along with her family and her brothers and father, had reason to suspect that an enemy or a suitor might have caused her fever. One can see how beliefs of this sort had the potential to turn ugly when suspicions were aroused and males went into action to retaliate as a matter of honor. It was not only uneducated people who used spells. Many educated elites also felt that they had to contend with their competitors' use of unseen, pernicious powers. The orator Libanius tells how he began suffering from debilitating headaches and rheumatism, which made it difficult for him to lecture or carry out his studies. He dreamt he was the victim of a magical attack. When he reported this to his friends, they went and searched his lecture room, where they found a dead chameleon. Examining the carcass, they inferred from its curious pose that it carried a magic spell. Its head was tucked between its legs, indicating a head ailment. Part of a hind leg was missing, suggesting an ambulatory impairment, such as rheumatism. And a forelimb was covering its mouth, indicating the silencing of the orator. Libanius was persuaded that rivals were revivals. Yeah. Must be this Methodist, Libanius was persuaded that rivals were responsible for his troubles. After his friends destroyed the chameleon, his headaches went away. You can see how a culture of suspicion might evolve from the common assumption that an illness was often sent by a rival. Suspicion of that kind would intensify every rivalry, cement factionalism, and, to use an especially apt metaphor, cause people to demonize their competitors as enemies. Jerry Toner, in a recent survey of popular culture and antiquity, finds other evidence that people in the Greco-Roman world were, in his words, less communal than we might otherwise suspect. He points to the high incidence of fables and proverbs that warn about conflict with neighbors and the untrustworthiness of friends. It is difficult to know how to assess such evidence and read it sociologically. But the New Testament and other early Christian writings reinforce the impression that people felt they had personal enemies and tended to deal with interpersonal conflict by framing others in oppositional terms as either friends or enemies. In Romans 12, for example, Paul instructs the community to treat enemies with kindness, which assumes that they think of themselves as having enemies. In Galatians, he asks the church, "Have I become your enemy by telling you the truth?" And he challenges them to be cautious in their interpersonal relations. "If you bite and devour one another," he says, "take care that you are not consumed by each other." We have a tendency to take such statements as rhetorical hyperbole. In Paul's world, they more likely reflect highly agonistic and oppositional ways of interpreting and experiencing interpersonal conflict, and a tendency to group into factions composed of one's own family and friends. Everyone outside becomes an actual or potential enemy. Toner suspects that the severe economic pressures under which ordinary people live was one cause of interpersonal hostilities. We might think of these conflicts as forms of horizontal violence. Instead of directing one's anger upward toward elites who control most of the social goods, that could be dangerous. One directed anger sideways toward others like oneself, who are competitors for a limited and fixed amount of resources. This perspective helps illumine the instruction in 2 Thessalonians that believers who refuse to work but depend on the community meal for their daily bread should be shunned but not regarded as enemies. The last part of this exhortation seems to assume that the Thessalonians, if left to their own inclinations, would likely treat these shunned members as enemies. Instead, the letter urges they should discipline the freeloaders as brothers and sisters. In other words, the purpose of the shunning is to restore the offenders to the church family and bring them back to the table. Given the precariousness of the average person's existence and his or her dependence on family and friends for survival, the social formation of the church as a family-like organization acquires special significance. And I will finish with a few remarks on this topic. In Pauline terms, God adopts believers in Jesus Christ, making them brothers and sisters to each other. Thus they form a family, a household of God, with special obligations to each other. Traces of this idea of the church as family are found in other parts of the New Testament as well. It appears to have been a dominant metaphor, and one that entailed concrete social implications. That the church constitutes a family explains a tradition that arose very early, namely the regular collection for the poor and the special care given by the church to widows. The word poor is a vague term when applied to the ancient Mediterranean context. A very large proportion of the population lived right at or not far above subsistence level. We might term these people the poor and call those below subsistence the destitute. But we should keep in mind that these categories are dynamic, not static. Some significant number of the destitute, if their circumstances do not improve, die, and some number of those at or above subsistence level are always vulnerable to falling below subsistence into destitution as a result of unemployment, illness, or accident, or loss of a husband or other male member of the household. Ancient Christians sometimes speak in general terms about giving to the poor, but they also have in mind especially those without resources, widows, orphans, those with chronic illnesses or disabilities, who have no family to care for them, or whose families cannot afford to care for them. There are indications of the church's care for the needy in the Pauline epistles, and in the book of Acts, which testifies to very old traditions about this, such as the daily distribution to widows. By the middle of the 2nd century, a collection for the destitute was a basic part of a liturgy at the church at Rome. Not a collection to support the church budget, which was evidently managed through internal patrons, but a collection specifically and exclusively taken up to aid those who could not adequately support themselves. This collection was taken following the celebration of the Eucharist and was perhaps understood as an extension of Eucharistic gratitude to God for through generosity to the needy, who are God's special concern. Justin Martyr, who describes this collection, mentions as its beneficiaries widows, orphans, the sick, those in prison, strangers living with the community, and any others in need. According to Cornelius of Rome, by the middle of the 3rd century, the church at Rome was supporting 1,500 widows and other needy people. And in the 4th century, according to Chrysostom, the church of Antioch supported some 3,000 widows and orphans. My point here is not to idealize the early church's approach to the material needs of people. The poor come into view in Christian texts chiefly as objects of pity, not subjects to be granted voice and power. This is especially true in the case of women. Nevertheless, over time, the church's engagement in merciful concern for the needy brought about a momentous shift in the culture. Roman beneficence was rarely directed by elites toward the destitute. And although people gave piecemeal to beggars, there was no organized relief in the Roman Republic or the early empire for those who suffered at the lowest levels of society. It was the church, influenced by its Jewish roots, that brought the category of these poor people into public discourse, endowing the neediest persons with special dignity and organizing institutional means for showing them compassion. Reflection on this topic puts early Christian meals in a fresh light, including certain teachings about meals in the New Testament, a passage in Luke 14, for example. The setting is a dinner party, a banquet, at the home of a Pharisee. In the course of the gathering, Jesus speaks on the topic of banquets, and at one point directs the following instructions to his host. When you give a midday meal or an evening banquet, do not invite your friends or even your brothers or relatives or your wealthy neighbors, lest they invite you in return and you have a reward. In other words, don't participate in a dinner party circuit in the customary way, according to the conventions of reciprocity, which benefit you socially and economically. Then Jesus goes on. But when you entertain, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, for they cannot repay you, but you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Now, there are a number of ways to interpret the significance of this for Christian practice, but I want to single out one way in which the ancient church took these words seriously. It applied them to its own meal practice. Consider Tertullian's description of the agape supper in the Church of North Africa. No matter how much this dinner may cost, Tertullian says, the church counts the expense worthwhile, since the cause of the expense is the number of inopes present, people without resources, who would otherwise go hungry. One of the chief purposes of the meal, Tertullian says, is to feed them. This supper in Tertullian's church in North Africa ends near sunset. The lamps are lit, and anyone who wishes is invited to step to the middle to sing their own hymn or something from Scripture. After the singing, there's a closing prayer. Then the people depart with full stomachs to their homes. And so ends a day in one corner of the ancient Mediterranean for at least some of the many poor of the Roman